stress, right? We have to make the difference between what is pressure and what is stress. By the way, in physics, pressure and stress have exactly the same units, Newton per meter squared. Right? That's the unit for pressure, that's the unit for stress. But pressure is the external part of it. Pressure is when we are in a situation, okay, that situation is what puts the pressure. Stress is entirely an internal concept. Every one of us, right, starting with the head of a state to a sports person, to a corporate executive, to a teacher, to a bank manager, to a domestic help or a student, everybody goes through pressure situations. In their life, in the task they have taken, they go through a lot of pressure. That is inevitable. But whether it stresses us or not is clearly a choice. We can choose to let it stress us, or we can choose not to let the pressure situation stress us. Can we convert? Yesterday in the WhatsApp group, we had a bit of a discussion around eustress. Eustress is really, you is like good. So eustress is good stress. Can we convert a stress into a eustress is where the challenge is. Can we convert that pressure into a stress, which is a good stress? So essentially what we are saying is pressure is inevitable. That's from the circumstances. But whether you want to get stressed or not is clearly a choice. We are not provided stress by anybody. We have to create stress in ourselves. But pressure is an entirely external concept. So stress is our internal reaction to a bunch of external situational items. That is what stress is. First, a couple of words about stress. The first thing is stress is good. Without stress, we won't be here. Without stress, it's unlikely we'll be alive, or rather our forefathers will be alive, or foremothers will be alive. It is critically important for us to survive. So if you're sitting in a forest with a full stomach and you're retiring for the day and you see a predator, you see an animal which is coming towards you, you need to get up and run. And that is caused by stress. If you don't get up and run, and if your brain is still supplying blood to your digestive organs and other places rather than providing a lot of energy, lot of blood supply to your limbs and the other organs which are required for you to move really fast and get away from the predator, you're going to be dinner that day for that predator. The problem really comes when we have no control over the stress. Right? A certain amount of stress is critically important for us even now. It's very important to achieve. But when we have no control over the stress which we are going through, then the external pressure just converts itself automatically into stress inside ourselves internally. And that is a problem. How does the problem come about? We talked about perception a few minutes back. If you're not able to change the way we look at things, the things we look at will not change. They will look the same. They will look daunting. They will look like stressful situations. And that will lead to a lot of automatic negative thoughts, leading to confusion about what is that I should be acting on? What is that I should be accepting? And then it feeds back in the perception into the automatic negative thoughts, back into acting and accepting. And that causes stress in us. So stress really is a biological term which refers to the consequence of the failure of ourselves to be able to respond to emotional or physical threats. It's not just physical threats, it's emotional threats or physical threats, and most importantly, actual or imagined. A few minutes back, we saw saying that all thoughts are real, but they are not necessarily true. But the brain doesn't know the difference. The moment it gets a negative thought, negative chemicals are secreted. And we feed and keep growing the negative thoughts inside our head, more and more negative chemicals come into are secreted by our brain, and they start traveling through our body, leading to a negative feeling. The brain doesn't know the difference between what is true and what is false. If it has a thought and the thought is real, in the sense I feel negatively, I'm going to miss the bus, a simple one. Whether you miss the bus or not, the anxiety chemicals have already been secreted in our brain. And for all we know, that we reached the bus stop on time or the bus came a couple of minutes late, we didn't miss the bus. Does that mean now all the chemicals are wiped out? No, they are secreted. It is done. It's water under the bridge or chemical under the brain in some sense. So whether it is actual or imagine, it has the same impact when it comes to the chemicals in our brain. What is this thing about stress? What gets triggered in our body? Because stress is a very physical thing, unlike automatic negative thoughts and perception, which is more a mental thing. Stress is highly physical. So now, in our system, okay, in the autonomous nervous system, we have this, which is called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the one which gets triggered. We were talking about a predator which is coming and chasing us, or we see a snake. And we can quickly, we don't even know, we come back and say, I don't know where I got this energy, but I was able to run so hard when something happened. And that energy is created by the sympathetic nervous system, which immediately triggers a stress response so that you can quickly move away from the danger. From the danger, the fight or flight response is decided, given by the sympathetic nervous system. Once we are at an elevated level of stress, then the cool off has to happen. And that cooling off is done by the parasympathetic nervous system. That cooling off, which is called the rest and digest, the feed and breed, is created by the parasympathetic nervous system. So what we need is both. When we witness or we encounter or we undergo a stressful situation, the sympathetic nervous system will trigger. And then once the stress is over or that is behind us, then the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. As a head of school, as a head of primary school, secondary school, or the whole school, as school principals, or people taking up leadership positions, very broadly speaking, there are 4 or 5 very, very large responsibilities we have. And each of these responsibilities, whether it is hiring and evaluating teachers, or leading the teachers, or student discipline, or proper conduct of students, or an orderly way in which the program gets delivered in a school, all of those things are our key responsibilities. In these key responsibilities, it's quite possible that we have deadlines which are unrealistic. It's quite possible that we have uncooperative colleagues. It's quite possible that we have parents who don't understand what we are coming with, and they all can lead to pressure. Whether they lead to stress or not is a choice, but more often than not, it leads to stress. But here is one myth about stress which we want to bust before we move any further. Stress is not created by how many hours you work. By the way, boredom is a very large stressor in human beings. Okay, boredom. not knowing what to do, not having anything to do is a huge stressor. So it is not about the number of hours we work. It is not even about how tough a certain assignment is. We saw that in flow. We said, greater the challenge, greater the difficulty, the more joy we will derive if we are competent. It is not about how complex our role is. It's not even about how good our team is, how cooperative our colleagues are. It is not about any of these things. Stress is not to do with how many hours you work. It is entirely about how do you feel when you're going through that process. When you're going through your work, how do you feel? Take a step back and ask yourself the question, how am I feeling at this point in time? And that assessment will tell us whether we are undergoing stress or we are not undergoing stress. There are different types of stress. We are not here talking about eustress and distress. We're talking about eustress is a positive stress. We are not even going to handle that. We are talking about three ways in which our stress comes. One of them is what is called an acute stress. An acute stress, think of it as something which quickly spikes and cools off. The sympathetic nervous system triggers, we give a stress response, and as soon as the stressor is done, then it cools off and we are back to parasympathetic nervous system. Right? We are back to a homeostasis, we are back to an equanimous place. Typical example would be something like a traffic jam, where it quickly triggers, we hit the brakes or whatever, we get frustrated about it, and after some time, it's done. Once we have reached the office, once we have reached home, it's done. So acute stress sometimes can become very frequent, and that is when we call it episodic acute. An episodic acute is, yes, it has a quick spike and a cool off, but within a few hours, I seem to be having another quick spike and a cool off, and a quick spike and a cool off, and a quick spike and a cool off, and it keeps happening. It is things like when we are generally irritable, under work pressure, overcommitment, delivery time, deadlines, all of that, constant worrying, all of those things lead to episodic acute stress, where it is an acute stress, which means it goes up and comes down quickly, but it's happening far too frequently and it's just going up and down and up and down and up and down. And that's leading to an emotional up and down constantly. And the third one, which is the most problematic one, is what is called a chronic stress. A chronic stress is when it is constantly present in us. Stressors tend to go the same stress if we don't know how to manage it. Right? Pressure is inevitable, but stress is optional. If we didn't exercise that particular option, stress has a tendency to go from being acute to episodic acute to chronic. Now, stress can impact all things with ourselves. It will impact us physically, it will impact us behaviorally, and it will impact us emotionally. In terms of physically, the way it will impact is it will lead to a higher level of blood pressure, the heart rate goes up, the blood supply to our digestive organs is not sent properly. There is not enough blood supply, which means our digestion suffers. And there's a whole set of responses which is there when we are constantly at an elevated level of stress. Behaviorally, it could mean we eat too much or we don't feel hunger at all, we eat too little. We don't feel like getting out of bed or we can't go to bed at all. We are awake all through the night. Every task which comes along, we tend to postpone it. We tend to snooze it. The calendar invite comes up and we say, okay, 1 hour, 3 hours, add 3 hours, move it to the next day. Procrastination. We're not able to take charge of our responsibilities. These are things which stress, the way stress manifests in behavior, these are some of the manifestations of stress. And emotionally, stress leads to being moody, being restless, irritable, short temper, impatience, and really there is no zest for life. There is no that feeling of waking up in the morning and saying, okay, what am I going to do? What Warren Buffett, we talked about long back, says, what makes you tap dance to work? That sense of purpose, the sense of joy, the sense of wanting to do something, that zest will be missing. We will still go through the grind, but that zest will be missing. And that's how it manifests emotionally. So, emotionally, behaviorally, and physically. Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, okay, said this, which is between the stimulus and the response. Stimulus is external. Response is our choice. Stimulus is the inevitable part. Response is the choice. He says between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. And therein lies our evolution, our growth, and our freedom. Now, the thing is, even if we are not able to capture that gap, which is between the stimuli and response, and we are still able to go back and rethink and redo some of it, it will still have a very positive effect when it comes to stress. Okay. So even if you're not able to instantaneously grasp it and do something about it at that moment, that's fine. But as long as we do it over a period of time afterwards. Now, that's all that is there as far as stress is concerned. There are very clear techniques which are there to reduce stress. The first of them is we have to figure out a way of actively triggering our parasympathetic nervous system. We have to cool down. We have to get down the sympathetic nervous system, which is at an elevated level, and it'll continue to stay there if it's a chronic stress. We have to bring that down, and that's triggering our parasympathetic nervous system. How do we do that? The first, easiest, and extremely practical one is conscious breathing. When you go through stress, just take 3 deep breaths. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for a few seconds, and breathe out for a very long period of time. A conscious, deliberate, deep breath. You can do just 3 deep breaths when you're in a stressful situation. It will completely clean out our stress which we are undergoing, and it will provide enormous clarity. Just try it, just 3 breaths. Even if you can't do 3, do one really solid conscious breath, which will take about 25 to 30 seconds. All right. The second one is meditation. Meditation is not just sitting idle. It is about getting into the state so that we are able to live the rest of our life for that given day in that state. So meditation is, of course, the action. It is also about the state in which we are in all through the course of the day, right? So it's a meditative state to get into through a process of meditation, which is sitting. There are many, many different types of meditation. We will talk about that when we come to embody. Similarly, mindfulness is something we will talk about in much greater detail in embody, but mindfulness is really about being in the present, not in the past, not in the future, okay, and without judgment, with full awareness. That is mindfulness. Just being there, where our sense organs are open, our perception the triggers for our perception is all completely open, so we are just able to perceive and see things for what they are, do things for what they are. That is mindfulness. And finally, any form of japa, any repetitive cognitive cue, if you're able to, whatever the response you want to, you can repeat that in your head many times. That is a japa. So we can say that. Okay, sports people do that very effectively, and a lot of professional athletes do japa, cognitive cues and affirmations quite well. So these are really the four relaxation responses. There are a few other tips. One of them is increase the level of physical activity. At least 45 minutes, if possible, of course, at least 30 minutes of physical activity, reasonably tough physical activity. If not, okay, a stroll will do as well. Second, the mind and body are hugely connected. So it's critical we eat properly. Okay, it's not about cutting out certain foods and reducing oil and everything else. It's about having the right balance, whatever makes us feel good. And if we are in touch with our physical body, when we do the physical exercise and the nutrition, we'll pretty much know whether it is working for us or not working for us. And the third one is sleep hygiene. And finally, laughter. Okay, laughter is not really about recalling and saying joy, telling jokes. It's more about a state of mind again. So mindfulness, meditation, laughter, or that lightness is all a state of mind. Keep our physical body in tip-top shape by doing physical activity and nutrition. And then if we can get into conscious breathing and here and meditation and japa, then our stress level can be brought down significantly. Yeah, that's as far as my part is concerned. I don't know if I did it in 20 minutes or a bit more, but yeah, there we are.